and this is BioPhoenix here, and today we're going to be taking a look at yet another Japan-only PS1 game, and that happens to be Blade Arts. And with a name like that, it almost sounds like a fighting game of some kind, sort of like Bushuti Blade, but instead, it's a third-person action-adventure game, and it was released in the year 2000, and was published by Enix, but the developer for this game is a very funny one. They are called EA Inc. Yeah, not to be confused with the EA that we all know and, well, maybe not really love, but you know the one. And because the names are so similar, trying to look up information on this other EA company was really annoyingly difficult. But without getting too much into it, I will say that there is a lot of very conflicting information about the games that they developed. Like, outside of this game, apparently they helped out with two games that were based after animes, being the Battle Angel game on PS1 and Lupin the Third and the Sorcerer King on PS2. But if you look up some of those games, you'll know that you'll never see any traces of this EA company being mentioned, so who knows? But before we get into the story of this game, I also do want to quickly mention that this is actually my second time trying to review this game, as I wanted to cover it years ago, but unfortunately there was no walkthroughs available at the time. But nowadays, there's actually quite a few different ones I've seen, so that means that this game is more than playable if you don't speak Japanese. So with all that out of the way, now let's begin and talk about the game's story. So it takes place in South America, where there is some strong earthquakes happening within a bunch of tombs. And there is a team of archaeologists that are trying to investigate this, and the main character happens to be Rei Shido. Although it is worth noting that sometimes with the translation, I've noticed that they do call him Zero, which I think might be his nickname. So technically, you can consider him to be a part of the ever-growing list of characters named Zero, because there's a shitload of them. But he does have other people with him, such as Brigitte Landers and Ranfa, who are two female characters that like to pester him. So during the first mission, he does eventually find a cool-looking sword, which happens to have some mysterious powers within it. And once he brings that back, they also do find out about some other artifacts like this orb thing. And not long after this, a group of totally not shady-looking people end up joining in, and they end up ruining all the fun, where that they end up stealing everyone's work, and even going as far to even kidnapping the other characters. So the main character, Rei, has to rescue them while going inside this ancient tomb where there's definitely some danger afoot. Now that sums up the basics of what you need to know about this game's story, but there is one character I haven't mentioned yet that is pretty important, and that happens to be Ilum, or Ilum, I don't know. But she has the word Lum in her name, which always makes me think of Yuritse Yatsura. So this character happens to be a spiritual girl that likes to teleport and talk to the main character by telling him, you know, the typical stuff that you would expect, like, "You're the chosen one, you're the one that has to put a stop to all this madness," and, you know, yada 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 kind of stuff. So pretty much, the whole story of this game is very similar to other things that you're very familiar with, such as Indiana Jones, Tomb Raider, and Uncharted, although of course that came later. But one obscure game that this game does remind me of a little bit in the story aspects is the game Enigma on PS1, which I covered years ago. So now, let's get moving on and start talking about the game's gameplay. So like I said, it is a third-person action-adventure game with some platforming, very similar to Tomb Raider, where you jump around collecting some items and doing some light puzzles here and there, and you take on many different enemies with your sword. But the main aspect of this game that sets itself differently from, you know, the other stuff that I've talked about, is that you only use the one sword after the first mission of the game, and that sword has magical powers where not only can you blast magic out of it, but also it has many different forms that can change shape. And how it changes shape is that you have to equip orbs to it, which you acquire as you progress through the game. And you can make these different forms stronger by dropping some experience points into the different stats. While this game does have some RPG elements to it, it's not your character that levels up, it's the weapons that do. Which I think is pretty cool, and does make it somewhat unique for a game in this sort of style, especially at the time when it came out. And thankfully, it is very easy to understand for that not only is it very straightforward, but also all the menus are in English. So now, let's get moving on and start talking about the game's controls. And I have to say, I was pretty impressed with how well they controlled considering when the game came out, because believe it or not, There are no tank controls in this game, and you can actually move around with the left analog stick. Like, holy shit. That aspect right there definitely makes this game a big step up compared to many other games that came out around this time that didn't even have any of this. Hell, there's even some games that came out after this that didn't even have these things either. But with that being said though, it's not 100% perfect, but I can say for sure that they're pretty good for what they are. X button jumps, triangle is to use your magic attacks, square button is the action button or the attack button when you have your sword out, and R2 is to go into attack mode by pulling your sword out, and you can block with the circle button. But if you hold R1 while pressing the circle button while moving in any direction, that's how you can do the dodge maneuvers. And holding L2 allows you to go through your item inventory, and pressing L2 again while you have an item out uses it. And pressing L1 allows you to face in front of you, but if you hold L1, then you can go into first person mode and look around. So it is a pretty decent button layout if I say so myself, even though I do think the rolling should have just been circle, but you know, despite that, I do think everything else is pretty easy to understand. But yet another thing I really like about this game that took me by surprise the first time I played it was that if you pull your sword out close to an enemy, you'll see that this game has a targeting system. Which I am so glad that this game has one, because as again, you'd be surprised how many games that came out around this time or even much later that don't even have one. But like I said before, it's not 100% perfect for that. Sometimes depending on the way that you're facing an enemy while you're locked onto them, you can still sometimes miss, which can be annoying, but I think that is more of an issue with the camera work than the targeting system, because sometimes the camera work can be a little bit clunky, because I do feel like at times that your character is facing a certain way because the camera just wasn't adjusted right or something. And unfortunately, you can't control it with the right analog stick. So yeah, I'd say that the camera work is one of the weaker parts of this game's controls. Because I do think that the combat itself in this game does feel pretty decent, like the attacking does feel pretty decent, and I do find the dodging in the game is pretty fun to mess with, and it's very simple and easy to understand. And moving around and jumping just feels really good and does hold up a lot better than you would expect. But one other thing I should mention too is that when you want to grab onto a ledge, you have to press square at the right time, and sometimes your timing on this can be a little bit tricky. Also, there are some ledges that look like they're way too high, but you can still grab onto them, so that's something that is worth noting. Because I remember the first time I played this, I had no idea how to get past a certain part because I didn't think I was able to grab onto a ledge because I thought it looked way too high for my character, but nope, he was able to do it. But overall, I would say that the game's controls are pretty decent and do hold up better than you would think, and I would say, yeah, I actually do think they're not bad once you get the hang of them. Now, let's get moving on and start talking about the other things, like the graphics, and yeah, I gotta say, the graphics in this game are really good for PS1 standards. Then again, this did come out, like, closer to the end of the year 2000, so obviously I do expect that it's gonna look a lot better than a lot of the earlier stuff, but even at that, I still think this is a good-looking game. But the first thing I have to note here was that the game's character designer was done by a really awesome artist, being Nobuteru Yuki, who has done a lot of amazing things that I really love, and the fact that it was done here, yeah, I approve. And the 3D models of these characters I do think look really good too. Definitely some of the better character models that I've seen on PS1. Although I wouldn't put it on the same level as Vagrant Story, Deception 3, or even Manic Game Girl's character models, but it's still very good looking and not too far behind. Also, one amusing thing I have to point out is that I do find the character Ilum, her design looks very similar to two things. She kind of reminds me of a character from the anime series, Neoranga, if she happened to have Estelle Bright's face and hair. And there is some pretty cool looking enemies and bosses you get to fight. I do like how some of the enemy robots look in this game. I think they look really cool. And the game's set pieces are really nice and do fit the whole ancient civilization look, which is a setting that I usually do really like in video games. And as you get farther throughout the game, you do start to notice that the ruins start to have some pretty interesting aesthetics to them, which I do like. But as much as I do like the game's set pieces and the way how they look, I do have to mention that there are some areas in the game that can look very similar to each other, and sometimes I do feel like that does make navigating a little bit confusing sometimes. But that's probably the most harsh thing I'll say about the graphics, because other than that, I pretty much like everything else about them. I like the art direction, I like the set pieces, I like the character models, enemy designs, all that. I think it all looks really good. And now, as for the game's music, the music in this game is, I'm not gonna lie, I do feel like it's a little bit lacking. That's not to say that I think it's bad, because no, it's not terrible, it's not annoying, it's just, it feels very middle of the road, I think. Now, the songs do fit the set pieces of where they belong to, and they're fine, and there is some atmospheric tracks, which are okay, but for the most part though, I do find that the music in this game is just not very memorable. Like, there's a couple tracks that I think are decent and not bad, and I do kinda like, but overall though, I would say that, yeah, I do think that the music could have been better, but it's not terrible by any means. The one positive thing I can say about the game's audio, though, has to be the voice acting. Now, I'm not going to go over all of these names here, but yes, I'm sure if you played a lot of different games and animes in Japanese language, then yeah, you would probably recognize a lot of these. And it is pretty impressive to have all these great voice actors in such a random-ass game like this. But of course, probably one of my favorite voice actors that I recognize here, and I recognized his voice immediately when I heard it, was Unsho Isazuka. And that guy is an absolute legend who does not need an introduction. But one amusing thing I do have to bring up, considering that I did mention the game Enigma, was that in that game, there was a character that looked very similar to Old Joseph from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and well, as you know, that is his voice actor. So I think it would have been kind of perfect if Unsho Isazuka played that guy from Enigma, and then the guy that played him played his character in this game. I don't know. I kind of wish it played out like that, but either way though, it's always cool to hear his voice in an old game. But as far as I can tell, I really have no complaints about the voice acting. Now, if you want to go out and buy yourself a copy of this game, if you have a way of playing Japan-only games, I'm shocked to say this, but the game is actually somewhat affordable. Now, there's not that many copies available on eBay right now, because, you know, most of the results keep showing up Soul Blade and Bashuti Blade, so obviously those get mixed up. But the few that I see of this game, Blade Arts, yeah, I was actually shocked that they're all less than $50. There's a loose disc for $18, and all the complete ones are about $40 to $45. Now, I know some people would still think that a PS1 game costing $45 is a lot, and yeah, you'd be right, but considering the times that we live in, where it seems like almost everything is like over hundreds of dollars now, so the fact that this isn't is a surprise to me. So now, as my overall thoughts on Blade Arts is that I actually liked this game. Yeah, I enjoyed it. So yeah, without repeating everything here, yeah, there is a lot of things I did mention earlier on that I did say I did really like. And I did mention a couple flaws too, such as the camera control, and also the game's music I think could have been way better. But as for the overall story in this game, as much as I am a fan of anything that's similar to Indiana Jones, I will admit and say that I do think the story in this game is kinda mid, and is overall full of a lot of cliches and a lot of typical things that you would expect. Like, I'm pretty sure just from my brief description of what this game's all about, you could probably figure out how this game's gonna end, and honestly, yeah, it's not a surprise. But knowing this though, do I think it's a bad story? No. Like, if it does have any redeeming thing about it, is that I do find that some of the dialogue between certain characters can be kind of funny sometimes, but outside of that, yeah, it's pretty mediocre. But that's not to say that I hate it, though, because no, like, I don't think every game needs to have this, like, super amazing, mind-blowingly, like, pretentious deconstruction bullshit story. Like, I think the story for this game and what it is, like, it's fine. Like, it's not great, but it's just kind of whatever. Like, it's definitely a game that you're not playing it for the story, or playing it for, like, a super deep twist or whatever. But if there is anything that does kind of suck about it, has to be the fact that there's a lot of cutscenes in this game, and you can't skip them. So, as much as I do really like this game, and I want to replay it all over again, yeah, doing that second playthrough without being able to skip all these cutscenes, yeah, that's going to be kind of annoying. Also, another flaw I do have to mention too is that for a lot of the puzzles and getting the items in this game, there's a lot of backtracking you have to do. And for what I said about how this game's level design, sometimes there's a lot of areas that do look kind of the same. Yeah, with the whole backtracking thing on top of that, yeah, some areas can kind of drag on like that a little bit. Now, one thing I will say is that the difficulty in this game is pretty easygoing for the most part. Like, there's not a whole lot of difficult parts until some of the later bosses, but outside of that, it's pretty manageable, I think. But if you do happen to die, unfortunately, there's no continues, and it takes a while just to get back to where you were, because once you die, it goes to game over, then it takes you to the main menu, and then you have to load your game, and then you gotta pick the file that you want to go back to, and yeah, it's just one of those things, it's just a little bit of a slow process. But thankfully, the save points are pretty easy to come by, and they're not scarce, which is good. But those are probably the most notable things that I can think of about this game that I can say are kind of flawed and I'm not the biggest fan of, but despite that though, I still like this game and I still think it is a pretty decently enjoyable game for me. So as again, I'm not going to repeat everything here, but I will say that, yeah, I liked using the different weapons that your sword can transform into. I thought they were pretty cool and fun to mess around with. And despite the backtracking you have to do for some of the puzzles, at least the puzzles are not super crazy bullshit, for that most of them are just trying to find a certain key item or just trying to look for a switch. So you don't gotta worry about trying to do some sort of, like, math quiz, and if you fail it, then you die or something. Also, another good thing I have to mention, too, is that despite this game having a lot of hazardous you gotta avoid, there's no one-hit death ones, which I am so glad for. So yeah, most of the traps and hazardous you gotta avoid, they usually don't do that much damage. And they are very easy to see, so you just gotta have precise movement, which, thankfully, this game actually does have some pretty decent movement going on, because could you imagine trying to do this shit with tank controls and jumping around? Yeah, the experience would be completely different. So yeah, despite some flaws, I do enjoy this game, and I do like it. I wouldn't say it's an all-time favorite game that's a must-play, but I actually kind of liked it. I definitely do appreciate a lot of things that it had going for it. And if you're a fan of the Tomb Raider games on PS1, I do think it's at least worth checking out for that. I personally, this is just a personal thing, is that I think this game, like, massively improves everything that those games tried to do. But even if you don't agree with me about it being better than Tomb Raider or not, I do think you could get some enjoyment out of it. And yeah, if this game ever does get a fan translation someday, I would gladly replay it again. So hopefully someday that can happen, but even if you wanted to play this game right now, it is very playable, especially now that there is some walkthroughs in case there are some parts that you might get stuck on. So with that being said, I'm glad that this game did not disappoint, for that it's another one of those games that I've always wanted to play for a long time, and now that I finally have, yeah, I enjoyed my time with it. So thanks for watching and commenting, and have yourselves a great day.
I'm a man of few words. Any questions?
Is the poop deck really what I think it is?
I like the cut of your jib.
What's a jib?
Promote that man.